Thorsby. Mark is an experienced association management professional with demonstrated abilities to lead associations and affecting significant positive change. He has a long-term track record of increasing revenue, judicious expense management, and exceeding operating surplus expectations. Known for his upbeat, energetic personality, he is an individual who is focused on results and helping organizational leadership to find desired outcomes. Please welcome Mark.
Thank you, Destiny. And what an irony it is that we're discussing nonprofit governance in the aftermath of a live example of how not to do things. And that it would, the Washington spectacle here a couple of weeks ago, and not only was it public and dramatic and frankly entertaining theater, it revealed the shortcomings of our democratic leadership selection process. Our focus today is thankfully more narrow in scope and impact, but often with the same vitriolic rhetoric, hurt feelings, and fractured agendas. Association leaders complain that finding good board members is becoming increasingly difficult. Potential association leaders are complaining that the work is not impactful, valued, or mission-focused. In short, it's not meaningful. The process most associations have used since their births are predicated on the principles of democracy. And how can anyone disagree with them? That is the process, I ask sarcastically. Specifically to associations, that process began to become less dependable at the beginning of the technology revolution of the late 1970s. The representative form of governance, where the governing body was comprised of various representatives of constituent groups that prior to technology could not coalesce efficiently or effectively due to cost, you could only speak through those representatives. This form was unwieldy and expensive. It was slow to respond as the world sped up, and as the speed of the world is accelerating, it is becoming less nimble. But instead of spending a lot more time making the case that governance in American institutions is somewhat outdated, if not broken, I asked each of you in advance to agree with the, with these three statements. And since you're attending this .org Community 30 on Thursday webinar, you have hinted that you agree that we can do better as associations. So let's explore the improvements that can be made. .org Community exists to explore the future of associations and offer insights and provocative suggestions about how associations might be different in the future and think different in the future. This webinar is intended to make you think about how your association defines, values, and selects your leaders. It is about culture. You will not agree, likely, with all that is presented this morning. Please suspend judgment. There is something here for everyone, no matter how good you're already doing. Let's dispel a myth. The nominating committee is not responsible for the quality of leadership delivered within the governing board. That's the job of the governing board. Too often the governing board unintentionally abdicates this fundamental board responsibility. After all, the nominating committee is without a doubt the most important committee that serves any association. Yet it can also be controversial, secretive, heavy-handed, unreasonable, biased, political, and criticized. But in the end, it is responsible for the identification, recruitment, and enlistment of the leaders of the association. And it is those leaders that will shape the future. So the nominating committee has a direct effect on the success of the association. For decades, the good old boys would gather in a room, complete with scotch, beer, and cigars, and select the new officers and board members of an association. Hopefully, those days are long gone. The ideal size, let's talk about the nominating committee though, from an organizational perspective. First of all, the ideal size is somewhere between 5 and 8. large enough to bring different perspectives and increase the likelihood that the candidates that have been suggested will be known by several members of the committee, but that the committee is small enough to work collaboratively and in confidence. The committee is comprised primarily, if not exclusively, of current or recently retired board members. Because it's only the board members who really know what the board needs in terms of talent, governance culture, and personal style. Some committees involve non-board members, but often find that they spend too much time teaching non-board members what's required for board service. So there's a trade-off, fresh air versus transparency and efficiency. The chief staff officer also plays an integral role in advising the committee, as they are, that is, the chief executive officer, are most often the most knowledgeable about candidates. The process, the process really begins with the charge to the nominating committee. And this is different than a job description. It is the responsibility of the governing board to communicate to the nominating committee what characteristics, perspective, styles, values, and experience the board believes are important of nominees. It also gives you an opportunity to take a look at underrepresented populations. And the board can direct the nominating committee then to secure representation from those populations. Take a look at the timeline. It really begins probably, for some organizations, as many as 7, for others maybe as 4 months in advance of sort of the selection process. There's a charge to the committee. Secondly, there's an important communication piece here to the membership, so that this doesn't become a smoke-filled room kind of a process. The nominating, the charge is well. Let me back up to the charge for just a minute. Again, that comes from the board of directors, but oftentimes the charge is written and drafted by the chief executive officer of the organization, and it spells out specifically what kinds of people, what kinds of competencies, what kinds of values are desired to serve on the board of directors. So then this communication to the membership is to outline the process to the membership. It outlines what the charge has been given to the committee by the board, and it invites members to suggest candidates to the nominating committee. However, the work of the nominating committee is much broader than simply dealing with those candidates that are suggested to it through the call to membership process. The nominating committee goes broader and beyond those candidates that are suggested kind of over the transom. The committee then compiles the initial list of candidates. You take a very, very clear look at the criteria, so that you begin to build some profiles of the kinds of people that you're looking for: young, old, geographic location, gender, insider, outsider, status quo versus boat rocker, big business, small business, big institution, small institution. You're trying to find as diverse and yet balanced a group to serve on the governance team. Once the criteria and the initial list has been established, then you go through a vetting process, obviously, where you're attempting to shorten the list. And then that is the time, I believe, where you may want to collect some more information about a short list of candidates. That can be done a variety of ways. It's done either in writing. Some associations do it in person, where they conduct interviews. The whole idea, again, is to begin to get more specific, get better information about each of the candidates. Then the process moves to select the nominees. We'll talk about one nominee per vacancy versus multiple candidates. in a minute. But and then there's a nominate. You contact the nominee. Obviously, the purpose of the contact is to make sure that the nominee, if selected, would be willing to serve. And then finally, when your nominations ballot, if you will, is finalized, then there's a final communication to the membership that is a follow-up to the initial communication that you had with the membership. It makes the case for why these candidates have been selected and how they will improve the overall quality of the governance team for your association. And then finally, either an election or a ratification, depending upon exactly how you use that process, which process you use. Just some quick advice to the nominating committee. Number one, past is not a predictor of future performance, particularly if the candidates come from a pool of people who have served in volunteer capacities within the organization previously, particularly in sort of those management committees, if you will, the unpaid staff of getting the work done of the association. Because you've excelled as a member or as a chairman of a committee doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be a great member of the governance team. Secondly, we talk about seeking out thought leaders, and what does that mean? These are people who are leaders in a profession or an industry who may not have served in volunteer capacities in the past for your association. They're people who are well known, and while you may not necessarily need a board of directors comprised solely of these folks, finding the thought leaders, seeking them out, recruiting them to serve can oftentimes change the dynamics of a governing board. Thirdly, the notion that service on a board is something that's earned, I think is today somewhat of an old-fashioned concept. Rather, it seems to me that it is the individual who's being honored. I'm sorry, that the association is being honored by the individual for their willingness to serve, not the other way around. So we often hear this with nominating committee. Oh, it's his turn. It's time. They put in their years. They deserve this. That's the kind of discussion I think that we're trying to discourage in today's nominating committee. The diversity and balance, I think, are a key attribute of a successful governing board. Getting it is the responsibility of the nominating committee. Getting that as diverse a group as you can, but balanced so that it doesn't become a dysfunctional group. And fifth out of 6 suggestions and pieces of advice to the committee, it's a matter of, for many candidates, it's a matter of when, not if. It's not if somebody should serve on the board, it's a matter of when they should serve on the board. And that determination is the responsibility of the nominating committee, and getting that, to get the right kind of diversity is a question of timing, perhaps, rather more so than competency. Just think if the Major League Baseball All-Star selection process did not segregate candidates by position. It's possible if you just had a list of, think of your association, a list of all the people who could serve as members of the board of directors. What happens, using that mixed metaphor, if you elected 9 catchers to your team? So we're looking for diversity and balance, and we can't have 9 catchers at any one time. So oftentimes it's a matter of almost scheduling, if you will, when particular individuals can serve on the board. And the last piece of advice that I've got is around culture. Organizations that have this statement as the foundation piece of their nominating culture are finding greater success, higher quality, higher caliber board members. The position seeks the person, not the person the position. This is counter oftentimes to the culture that exists within the organization. But if you can if you can achieve this kind of a culture, it changes the dynamics of the selection process. So yeah, let's take a look at this election selection. You know, this is a hot debate right now. The case for a one nominee for one position, the so-called slate, is overwhelming, and we're seeing more and more associations making that shift from an open contested election to a single nominee for each volunteer. One of the driving forces for that is the need to protect the volunteer resource. I mean, you ever thought about the nominations process from the perspective of the candidate? Have you thought about what are we asking candidates to give to your association? They give their reputation, they give their time, they give their money. Even if you reimburse their expenses, it costs people money to serve on boards of directors. They give their clout, they give their name, they give their connections. And it seems to me that we have the responsibility to make darn sure that our association is worthy, and that we have to make sure that the nominations process is respectful of the candidates and to the association's need to enlist the right team of volunteers. I think what we've seen in Washington over the past couple of weeks is likely to make our jobs getting volunteers to make themselves available to serve is going to be increasingly difficult. And to the extent that they've got to subject themselves to an election process, I think makes the likelihood of people volunteering decline. One of the things that we have observed over the last 20 years is that the people that have the competency and the desire and the passion and the skills to be good board members don't have the time. And conversely, those with the time oftentimes lack the competencies, skills, and passion that we're looking for in our volunteer leadership. So, you know, is it time for a change? You know, if you're having troubles finding good board members, if you've been accused of being an old boys club, or if in fact you've seen your board perform and it's clearly a dysfunctional or even slightly dysfunctional governance team, I suggest that now is the time for us to find a different way to select our leaders going forward. We may be the last institutions of the 19th century to undergo change, significant change. And we're beginning to see, if you're going to affect that change, it begins first with the governing board, as that's where the success buck stops for most associations. So that's all I've got for prepared remarks. I think we're ready and available to handle any questions that anyone may have.
Hey, Mark, you know, I have a question. I'm actually a nominating chair. It's funny. And I was wondering, who should chair the nominating committee? I'd like to hear what you have to say about that.
Yeah, I think what we see most frequently is the immediate past chief elected officer, either president or chair of the board. There are some associations that are experimenting with that. They are instead appointing a committee and allowing the committee then to select their own chair. I mean, if you think about it, the chair of the nominating committee doesn't really have any more or less authority and or accountability than anybody else on the committee. They're really there to chair the conversation of the committee members and to facilitate the process going forward. But it'll be interesting. I think the jury's still out as to whether that works. But so far, I think you'll see with most associations, it's the immediate past chair. And it's because they got experience. They understand the leadership needs of the current board because they were just there. And more than likely, they may know more volunteer candidates out in amongst the membership than any other one single individual.
Thank you. If you have any questions, please type them in the chat bar to the side of the webinar screen. Also, I have another question for you, Mark.
Sure.
If you currently have a contested election process and want to move to selection, is there a way to ease into it?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's a great question, and one that comes up frequently. The technique that I've seen used most frequently, and I think it's fairly effective, is that as you go from a contested election where the contest is amongst the membership, my preference is to move the contest back into the nominating process so that the candidates are properly vetted and the contest takes place there. But once those nominees have been selected by the nominating committee, to allow a process where other members of the association or people who are eligible to serve on the board of directors could be added could be nominated through a petition process. And typically what you see is a fairly high threshold of the number of signatures to add somebody as a nominee to the ballot. Maybe it's 5% of the membership, as an example. But there's a petition to make an individual nominee. This sort of gives you that. Well, if the nominating committee goes completely off the rails, there's some way you can control it. It also allows the red ants of any association to have some voice, but you set a fairly high threshold in terms of the number of members of the association that have to support that individual's nomination. Then you would have a contested election with one or more individuals who would become nominees through the petitioning process. And then if there are no other nominations, typically then the slate is considered elected, and you avoid having to send out election ballots, et cetera, to the membership.
Very good.
Interesting, think about your own association. What % of your membership actually participates in the election process? I suspect it's far less than what even takes place in the election process in the United States. Most of your members, frankly, don't really care. They care, but they don't really care, because who serves on the board doesn't really affect the value of their membership in the association. So.
Very good. It looks like we have a couple of questions that came in. So let's see. If your association still sees a position on the board as being earned by committee or volunteer service, how do we as staff work to change that?
Well, I mean, everything we've talked about this morning is all about change and change management. We've got to have support from individual board members and collectively from the team. To sit down, I'd begin with staff and the chief executive officer of your organization talking about this and seeing if the change is desired. And then to begin the process of looking throughout the board to find out if there is an openness and willingness to at least explore different ways, alternative ways to the way that we've been doing it. I think if you can also identify areas where you're kind of slow to make decisions, you've made bad decisions, you're being criticized. I mean, what you're trying to do is create an air of desired change, and to find at least one other person on the board who can begin as a ally and to at least begin to get this issue discussed. There's plenty of information and writings in the association management literature that you could share with your board, saying, hey, I saw this article, thought you might be interested. Obviously, bringing in an outside speaker to talk about how associations are changing the way that they're selecting board members could be helpful. All of this, you're trying to just get people, as we're doing today with this webinar, we're trying to get people to think differently about some very long-held traditional beliefs and challenges that we've all faced as an association.
Correct. So actually, to piggyback off that, we have another question. What message do you give to the general membership as you switch from contested to non-contested? Obviously, the vetting process is a key pro, but how do you answer the question of trust and avoiding the good old boys club?
Yeah, I think there are several ways to address that. The one I find most compelling, having served on boards and having been through the selection and election process, is what I talked about earlier. I think we've got to protect our volunteers. If you want really good volunteers, if the quality, as we go back to the three statements that we said at the beginning of the webinar, if you believe that the quality of leadership cannot be left to chance, then the need for a rigorous procedure and process of selecting leaders, rather than simply assembling a ballot and sending it out to everybody, and having 10% of your membership vote on people that they don't know, which is, I think I've just defined the process that most of us use. I think it's too important. We've got to protect those good volunteers. Will not subject themselves. They usually won't subject themselves to that kind of public scrutiny and the potential. We've all seen it, I'm sure. Somebody is on a ballot, is not elected, and they drift off into the sunset, and they tend to feel rejected. Nobody likes to feel, if they're really a quality volunteer, nobody likes to kind of lose in that selection process. And so I think it's mostly around protecting the volunteer resource, rather than trying to deal with this one person, one vote, democratic, civics class stuff that we've all learned in high school. I think it's great civics, and I think it's great democracy, but I don't think it's real good association management leadership selection.
Thank you, Mark. It looks like we have one last question, and it's from Susan. Is a ballot process and a general session at an annual meeting the most effective way to create a new slate of officers where there's potential for bias, or an electronic ballot to all your membership better?
I think the latter. If you agree one nominee for one vacancy, then you don't even need that, because there's nothing to vote on. Although I know that there are associations that maintain that election where there is only one candidate for each vacancy. I think that you can see where membership can get a little cynical about, why are we going through this charade of having an election when there's only one candidate for each nomination. So I would discourage any kind of a ballot if you've got one nominee for each vacancy. If you do have a contested election, though, I think an electronic ballot is desirable, and more desirable over doing it in person. In person, I just think opens itself up to mischief, if you will, and people organizing small groups. Really divisive kinds of behaviors within an association. And so at least if you've got to have a contested election, at least do it electronically. But don't be surprised if participation is really low.
Right. It looks like we have a couple more questions, actually.
All right. Well.
How do you take the rejection problem out of the nomination then? If not a public election, there's still a rejection of a nominee.
Yes, but it's done on a much smaller scale, on a much more private scale. You haven't subjected the person to kind of that public embarrassment. Oftentimes that conversation leads to, again, remember how we talked about the position seeks the person, not the person the position? If you can build that culture into it, there is no rejection, because I'm willing to serve, I'm willing to serve, and I'm not going to be bummed out if I'm not selected, though, because I'm not seeking the position. If somebody wants me to think about, if any of you have ever served or know people that have served on cause-related association boards of directors, heart association, lung, the 501, a lot of the 501c3s. Serving on that board, there's never, I don't know of many contested elections. again, somebody comes to my office or home and asks me to serve on the board of directors. And while the board may have approved somebody coming and approaching me, there typically is not an election process.
Okay, we have one more question. Like it's the last one. Our bylaws require voting by the membership. Do you know if that could be a state requirement?
Huh. That's a good question. Could be. It could be, and in which case, then fine. We'll have an election with one candidate. What the state does not prescribe is a contested election. They may say that the membership has to participate in the election process. They may say there has to be an election, in which case then you provide a slate with one candidate, one nominee for each vacancy, and they can vote. That could be in some states a requirement, but I'm not the attorney, and certainly not one in all 50 states.